dated manuscripts, paintings, and carvings show that instrumental accompaniment for songs and dances was an integral part of the medieval sound world. Yet no one is certain exactly what combinations of instruments and voices were heard, or in which kinds of music. Welcome to Music History Podcast by Viola Studio channel. Zither and Lyre, Sackbut and Shawm. Wandering minstrels and troubadours were expected to play a wide range of instruments, as is clear from an anonymous 13th century poem.
I'll tell you what I can do. I'm a minstrel of the viol. I can play the bagpipe and the flute and harp, symphony and fiddle, and on the psaltery and the rote, I can sing a melody right well.
There seems little doubt that medieval instrumentalists prided themselves on their versatility, but it is difficult to reconstruct what kind of repertoires were played on which instruments. Certain instrumental groupings were associated with specific functions or settings. Haute instruments, such as shawms, sackbuts, trumpets, and drums, were used outdoors for street processions and dancing, to herald the royal presence, or will cover to urge troops into battle. The role of the bass instruments, such as harps, lutes, rebecs, viols, recorders, and flutes, was generally more intimate, to accompany songs and to provide background music or entertainment during banquets and other indoor gatherings. Music for every occasion. In his De Musica, of around 1300, French theorist Johannes de Grocio expected instrumentalists not only to play a wide range of instruments but also to have a wide repertoire.
A good fiddler generally performs every kind of cantus and cantilena, and every musical form.
Throughout the medieval period, stringed instruments, both plucked and bowed, were used to accompany songs, especially the epic poems and ballads with strong storytelling elements. The anonymous mid-13th century Romance of Flamenca describes the proliferation of such performances.
What with the hum of the viola players and the noise of so many storytellers, the hall was full of sound.
Traces of this repertoire accompanied by the viola, a small guitar-shaped instrument similar to the lute, survive in the anthologies of violists from 16th century Spain. Tablature. The introduction of the printing press in the latter part of the 15th century would transform how music was recorded and circulated. Tablature was another innovation that became widespread. This form of notation was based on letters or numbers that indicated finger placings on the frets along an instrument's neck. Until then, instrumental accompaniments tended to be learned by ear, committed to memory, and improvised at each new performance. Tablatures seem to have evolved around the time that players of plucked string instruments such as the viola and the lute began to use their nails or fingertips instead of a plectrum or pick. These players could now read and perform arrangements of polyphonic pieces and compose new and more complex works. Instrumental ensembles. The long lists of instruments found in medieval poems and the angelic orchestras depicted in altarpieces and carvings suggested a symphonic scale of musical accompaniment that greatly appealed to the specialist ensembles of the 20th century early music revival. In the 1960s and 70s, many of these groups were formed by virtuoso instrumentalists and arrangers keen to make what might seem relatively simple or repetitive music more interesting through kaleidoscopic instrumental scorings of surviving vocal works. In reality, medieval ensembles such as the alta cappella, bands that played shawms and slide trumpets in courts and cities of continental Europe, were employed to accompany banquets and dancing but, it seems, rarely singers. Indeed, songs may often have been performed a cappella, in church style, and therefore unaccompanied. Instrumental groups varied from region to region. Wind bands of shawms, sackbuts, and dulcians found particular favor in Spain from at least the early 16th century, when groups of these instrumentalists became salaried employees of the great cathedrals. Musical angels. In addition to regional variations, certain combinations of instruments may also have performed on certain occasions. For example, an ensemble of 3 or 4 bass instrumentalists, generally dressed as angels, took part in the annual Corpus Christi procession, as the host was carried through the streets. Yet little is known about exactly what kind of music these angelic musicians might have played on these important civic occasions. The same is true of the less formal groups of musicians who accompanied the medieval mystery, or miracle plays, popular dramas that reenacted cycles of biblical stories, often on wagons as part of a procession. These ensembles were usually made up of amateur musicians who had learned their skills informally. Professional instrumentalists often came from musical dynasties or contracted apprenticeships. Many players also attended the international minstrel schools held in northern Germany and Flanders in the years around 1400, at which techniques and repertoire were exchanged. From dusty streets to courts and cathedrals, Europe was humming with continually evolving musical accompaniment. After new instruments and instrumental groupings soon widened the scope of musical accompaniment in the late 15th century. Improved metal working led to the invention of the slide trumpet so that players could achieve a greater range of notes by extending the tube length. The double-slide sackbut, an early form of the trombone, evolved to provide low notes in the wind ensembles that began to accompany sacred polyphony in church. The advent of music printing in the 1470s created a demand for songs with instrumental accompaniment that could be performed by amateurs at home. As instrumentalists began to play polyphonic music, instruments of the same family were made in several sizes to form consorts or groups, with a wider range. The viol consort was a common example, playing music for 3 to 7 parts, as were consorts of wind instruments, such as recorders or crumhorns. Thank you for listening to Music History Podcast by Viola Studio channel. Please leave us your comments and opinions.